You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.
Welcome back to all our listeners to this podcast, On the Way Home. This is where we explore the people, ideas, and systems shaping housing and homelessness responses across Canada. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly, and today I'm joined by Nick Falvo, one of Canada's leading researchers and thought leaders on homelessness and affordable housing. Nick's work spans policy analysis, research, and education, and he's widely recognized for helping organizations and leaders and governments better understand and respond to homelessness with housing. Let's jump in. Nick is back on the Way Home, an expert in his field. Today, Nick is going to narrow down for us one word. What does home mean to you, Nick?
Safety. You used to give us more than one word, but I'm up for the challenge.
Well, because you've been on before, this time you only got one word. That's a good one. And as one of Canada's leading experts on homelessness, what trends or shifts are you currently seeing in how homelessness is being addressed across Canada?
Well, sadly, a lot of what I'm noticing in terms of trends isn't positive. And so I'm going to be a bit of a Debbie Downer today, but one of the things that really concerns me is the overdose crisis. And overdose deaths are going down a little bit. There's some sign of it going down, like opioid-related overdose deaths, most of which are accidental. Something like 97% are accidental. But there's still a lot of them, and I'm really concerned about that. I'm seeing more visible signs of this as a citizen than I did, say, 10 years ago, and certainly far more than when I worked in the field. When I worked in the sector as a frontline worker, I think in 10 years working in the sector, I did not see one overdose. 10 years of working directly with people experiencing homelessness. And now if you worked at a large shelter, say in Calgary, I don't think you'd get through a shift without there being one overdose on that shift, like someone, so it has changed. The overdose crisis is very much in front of us. And one thing that I find really depressing about that is the politicization of the overdose crisis. I think, there was a time when elected officials would have all-party committees studying things, rolling up their sleeves, listening to experts. And I don't know if that's driving this very much anymore. When the UCP government formed power in Alberta, I think 2019 it was, Premier Kenny, they immediately started referring to supervised consumption as NDP drug sites. That's not helpful. That is not a helpful way to move forward on an issue. And then in December 2021 in Alberta, there was a select special committee to examine safe supply. And obviously it was a committee with parliamentarians on both sides of the floor. It was going to be UCP and NDP MLAs. We call them MLAs out in Western Canada. In Ontario, you call them MPPs. And the NDP members started to notice that the experts who were going to be providing evidence to the committee seemed to be skewed in a certain direction. The opposition MLAs did not like what they saw. They were concerned about where things were going. And so all four opposition MPs resigned from the committee in protest, just 2 months after it was struck. We've got to stop doing politics that way in Canada on the overdose crisis. The overdose crisis is far too important to be politicized, and I hope we can start doing better. To your question, other trends concern me. Build Canada Homes was announced with much fanfare last fall. The first deal with a municipality was struck with the city of Ottawa late last year, so late in 2025. About a month later, I started getting on the phone with experts in Ottawa in the affordable housing sector who, a month after the deal was struck, had not even basic details on what it was going to involve. So it was essentially a behind closed door deal struck between Build Canada Homes and a few City of Ottawa representatives. Not a good way to make policy. behind closed doors like that. We can do better. So I'm concerned about the way Build Canada Homes is moving forward. Social assistance remains such a thorny issue in Canada. Of course, when I say social assistance, I mean income support provided to very low-income people who have weak or no labor market attachment. This is not a popular issue, and as a result, politicians avoid it. They don't like to look it in the eye and apply what I would call evidence to what they do. And so benefit levels remain very low. And then that makes it very hard for people like yourselves, the nonprofit housing sector, who are trying to create housing affordability for people with very little money. If social assistance was doing its job and benefit levels were higher, non-market housing providers and people in the homelessness sector would have a much easier opportunity to do their job. And then I think the last issue I want to raise in terms of what's going on nationally is this persistent issue of NIMBY, not in my backyard, that when a nonprofit or a municipality wants to establish an emergency facility or supportive housing, they face fierce community resistance. And NIMBY is like a persistent case of athlete's foot. It just keeps coming back. It doesn't go away. And people all across the country tell me that this just remains. NIMBY is a barrier to creating emergency facilities and supportive housing, and even just non-market housing in general. So sadly, I'm seeing a lot of trends affecting stakeholders across the country, and a lot of them aren't good.
You've been recognized with CMHC's President's Medal for outstanding housing research. So congratulations on that. That's amazing. What piece of your work are you most proud of, and why?
Yeah, well, on that issue of the award, I think it was about 5 years ago, I was approached by a Calgary-based nonprofit housing provider. They're now called Onward. Their CEO is somebody named Martina Jilakova, who's well known in the Canada's non-market housing sector. And they reached out to me and they said, Nick, we want to do better in terms of how we house Indigenous tenants. We are seeing negative exits from our housing units, and they're not good. And outcomes just do not seem as good for our Indigenous tenants as other tenants, and we want to do better. So could you help us figure out what's going on and what could improve? And this was the research that led to the CMHC award. And I'm happy to say that the Community Housing Transformation Center funded the project. So that was a nice collaborative effort. They were a wonderful funder to work with. And the first thing I did was I formed an advisory committee of Indigenous people who advised me every step of the way. We met monthly, and they were incredible. So we had like a great client in Onward who wanted to see good results and did not provide any kind of barrier to me in finding out what was going on. We had a great funder in the Community Housing Transformation Center and an amazing advisory committee consisting of Indigenous people. And that set the table. From that point on, my work was easy. And I was also fortunate enough that in spite of the fact that we were right in the middle of the pandemic at the time, I was still able to interview quite a few tenants, so Indigenous tenants at Onward. And I was able to ask them a lot of questions about what they were experiencing and what would help them. And I just listened to them. I didn't bring in any preconceived notions as to what was needed. There wasn't a great literature out there on what was needed. And the interviews were incredible. And we also had some great interviews with Indigenous providers in other parts of Canada, especially in BC. And really, I just listened to what people told me with the support of a great advisory committee, and the rest was easy. And lots of things got recommended that I wouldn't have expected coming into it. One of the interesting things that came about was people talked about the orientation process for new tenants at Onward. And it was something I never thought about before. What happens when a new tenant moves into a unit? And one of the things we learned was that historically, a tenant would get handed the keys to a unit, have a quick conversation with somebody, very quick interaction, and they were set. And the advice I got along the way in doing this research when talking to Indigenous peoples was to just take your time. Don't rush through orientation. maybe have 3 meetings, maybe have one of them with an elder, maybe use the medicine wheel for that one. Talk about the supports that the person wants. There was just so much opportunity to get started on the right foot. And so one of the recommendations was to have a better orientation process. Another key recommendation was to have on-site cultural programming. Ideally, you want to make tenants feel welcome, and sometimes the so-called intangibles are crucial. So having on-site cultural programming on a regular basis in your buildings is one way of sending a message that you are welcome here. This building is for you. Having access to elders outside of that process too, an elder you could reach out to on a regular basis was also found to be important. Optics too, and representation. The board of the organization, there was opportunity for it to have more diversity amongst the board. The staffing, there was more opportunity for that to be monitored and for there to be more diversity amongst staffing. An annual survey of Indigenous tenants. So lots of just great recommendations we got. And honestly, I listened. The local Indigenous community was very supportive when they heard them, even though I'm a white guy. I mean, people said, okay, dude, like you did it right. You listened. You did process okay. It was okay. They were very accepting of this. And CMHC recognized that with the award. And it was just a great collaborative effort.
That's awesome to hear. And, Nick, I've been thinking about how you've been organizing international study tours for a while. How many years has it been?
It's been about 4 years.
So what inspired you to start these tours?
I was starting to realize how insular we are as Canadians. Like, we have our own conferences. Like, there's a great conference every spring organized by the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. There's a great conference in the fall organized by the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. But we don't really go outside our own borders. And we probably should. We should go east, we should go west, maybe not south right now, but eventually we'll start going back to the US. I was of the view that there was great work happening in the affordable housing and homelessness sectors in other countries, that we could go and have study tours there, learn a lot. And I thought there was an opportunity there. And I knew that Steve Pomeroy had done some previously. I knew that they were not unprecedented. In fact, I know from the historical part of my PhD thesis that study tours were happening even in the early 20th century in Canada. People going over with top hats and trench coats to London, for example, and then coming back to Canada on a boat, that kind of stuff. Like, that used to happen. That was how policy got transferred at one time. And so I realized there was an opportunity there. What I probably didn't realize was the networking. I did not realize how rich the networking would be, because what happens with these study tours is 30 people get brought to, say, London or New York or Chicago from Canada. And in many cases, the participants get to know someone who does very similar work in another part of Canada. So in addition to learning about what their international peers are doing and seeing firsthand what's going on, I started to realize people were also getting great networking amongst their Canadian peers. So I was inspired, I would say, by the lack of study tours, the fact that I knew they had existed previously, and that there was just a golden opportunity for some incredible networking.
Let's talk about your February 2027 study tour. I hope I'm getting the dates right there. And you're taking a trip to Amsterdam and Rotterdam with those who are going to join you. What were you hoping to focus on during this trip? Why did you choose Amsterdam and Rotterdam as the focus? Share with us a little more.
Yeah, well, the Netherlands have always been forefront in my mind when it comes to non-market housing. And that goes back years. I remember when I got in this sector in the late 1990s, I started to read academic articles, including some written by David Hochansky, George Fallis, Steve Pomeroy, Greg Sutter, others. And every now and then there would be a comparative look at non-market housing across OECD countries. So they would compare, they would do a rate of social renting. So they would, rate of social renting is the percentage of a country's total housing stock that is considered social housing. Then we started saying community housing. Now we say non-market housing. In Canada, it's about 3.5 or 4% right now, depending on whose methodology you use. But I remember years ago hearing that in the Netherlands, it was like 40%. It's a little lower than that now, but essentially they had way more non-market housing than we did. I never really understood why, but I thought it was incredible. Like, as somebody who was so passionate about non-market housing, as somebody working frontline in Toronto where there wasn't enough non-market housing by a long shot, I was so inspired to hear that there was this country on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, with whom, by the way, Canada has a wonderful, rich history stretching back decades. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice to learn about the Netherlands and all of their non-market housing? Like, what is that about? What does it look like? What's it like for teachers and police officers and nurses to live in that? What's it like to normalize non-market housing? And so that's what inspired me to do that. I'm also fairly well connected. I'm on the editorial board of the International Journal on Homelessness. There is somebody on the editorial board based in Amsterdam who has been helping me with this. So that was lovely. And then as I started to do some research into this, I learned that Rotterdam, which is about an hour away from Amsterdam, Rotterdam has Europe's largest port. It's a port city. They've done apparently some very inspiring work along the harbor with their housing, and that it's a city to see, especially a contrast. And one thing I have learned from these study tours is, if possible, participants do like to see a couple of cities. 3 is probably too much, but 2 is good. So we're gonna learn about all the rich non-market housing in the Netherlands. We're gonna see 2 cities, and you notice that earlier I made a comment about the overdose crisis and how we're handling it in Canada. The Netherlands have a rich history of working with evidence on the overdose crisis. They have been doing harm reduction work for decades. They were in the forefront way before Canada was. So you got the rich history of non-market housing in the Netherlands, and you've got a strong history with good policy on harm reduction. I thought it was pretty win-win, and registration will open May 1st, so we're excited.
That does sound exciting. I'm half Dutch. My brother was born in Rotterdam. I was born in Amsterdam. But yeah, it's interesting. Like, I didn't grow up there, but talked to my family there about the housing piece sometimes. What would you say that people who choose to come on this tour can expect to experience? What will they see, learn, hear? You did touch on it a bit. Just thinking about those who are listening, who may be considering joining the tour, what kind of experience they can expect, or what they'll walk away with.
One thing you can expect is nuanced curation. And so what I mean by that is, we've all been to those conferences in another city where they say, oh, on the last day of the conference, you get to do a site tour, or you're going to get 2 site tours, and here are the options. Like, we've all been to those conferences, and that's lovely. In my experience, when conferences do that as an add-on, it's rushed and it's fast. So somebody gets sent a text, somebody at that local site will get sent a text, and they'll be asked to show up and receive some conference delegates and show them around for an hour. I've been on those tours. You get what you pay for. They're not good. Often the times the person's not prepared. They just found out about it. They let you in. They walk you around. They say goodbye. Like they've shown you. My study tours are very different. It takes me 2 years to plan a study tour. I build up networks over the course of many months. I reach out to people. I use my networks to introduce me to people. I have multiple conversations with site tour leaders. I create a long list of possible sites to see. I interview the local site tour leaders ahead of time, often a year ahead of time. And then I start to cull the list. So there might be a possibility, 15 possible site tours, and we get it down to 8 good ones, because I'll start to realize that some of them just are not offering anything innovative. So I shortlist it, and I weed out the ones that would be a waste of people's time because they're nothing new or nothing that Canadians aren't already familiar with. So there's nuance, there's curation, there's 2 years of planning. So by the time you show up, it is something new, it is something innovative, it is something worth listening to or seeing. You get high quality. When you spend 2 years planning something, you get results, and that's definitely what I noticed from these study tours. But you'll also get some first-rate networking, as I alluded to earlier. I mean, this may sound dorky, but for me, a highlight of one of the tours was being in an Uber XL minivan traveling from downtown New York City to Bergen County, New Jersey a couple of years ago with Michael Braithwaite and several other CEOs of nonprofits. And we had, a 30-minute conversation about board governance and the role of CEOs and the interaction of the two and what makes a great board member. And you don't get to have those conversations for 30 minutes with your peers very often. And a lot of the time on these tours, what will happen is you'll link up with 2 or 3 people, and they'll sort of become your study tour buddies for the week. You end up at dinner with them on a Tuesday. You end up at dinner with them on a Wednesday. You end up walking with them for 40 minutes on Thursday morning. By the end of the tour, you've gotten to know some people really well. And these are people you may want to reach out to later for help. That CEO who's got 7 years more experience than you on similar projects in another part of the country, you might want to send them a text sometime and ask them a question. Well, if you didn't know them ahead of time, you won't have that trust. But when you build up that trust and that network, all of a sudden you're well positioned to be more productive as an employee. So that networking, I think, is first rate.
How many spots are there? Did you say 30?
They're usually 30. Yeah.
So this is an open registration tour launching May 1st. For anyone who's listening, May 1st, registration opens. Nick, could you tell us who is this really for, so that those who are listening can consider whether it's right for them? Is it geared more towards policymakers, frontline workers, or just anyone interested in housing and homelessness and what we can do better over here?
Well, to your point, it is absolutely open registration. You do not have to be a member of an organization to join. You don't have to pay a membership fee of any kind. You just sign up to register for this study tour. It's a lot of people in the nonprofit sector who end up going, people in the affordable housing sector and the homelessness sector. It's usually manager and above. And that is generally because the typical nonprofit organization can send maybe a couple of people. Usually they don't send 3 or more. Usually it's 1 or 2. And when they do that, they usually like to pick someone relatively senior. So it's usually either a CEO, a vice president, a director, maybe a manager. They usually don't send frontline workers. I think a frontline worker would get a lot out of a study tour, but I'm not going to tell nonprofits how to, organize or how to prioritize who gets to go to conferences. But it's usually manager and above. Lots of people in the nonprofit sector. I love it when public servants come. Sometimes it's tricky for them because they have an approval process that can take many months, but many public servants do come. We've had some elected officials. I like that too. And I encourage academics to come. A lot of academics don't do this. They do academic conferences and they're funded to go and present at academic conferences, so it can be tricky for them. But we have had academics, and I think it's absolutely beneficial to academics.
So for listeners who may not be able to attend, are there potential benefits they'll eventually be able to glean from the study tour?
I'm so glad you asked this, Emmy, because I did 10 years as a frontline worker in Toronto, and I was at a grassroots organization most of that time. We did not get to go to conferences or go on study tours, but I loved reading. And with this study tour, if you don't go on the study tour, okay, you won't get the networking, but you will get a 30-page report afterwards. Because what I do, as you well know, Emmy, is I'm taking vigorous notes during all presentations. I then send them to the presenters afterwards for a little bit of quality control. I take notes of our webinars ahead of time. And by the end of it, I put it all together in a 30-page document that I call them summary notes. And within about a month after the tour ends, it becomes a public document that lives on my website at nickfalvo.ca. And I'm really passionate about that because money should not be a barrier. Money and time should not be a barrier to learning about this stuff. And so that way, if you're not one of the 30 people fortunate enough to go, you can still benefit enormously from them. And the summary notes include the names of the presenters and email addresses of the presenters, so you can always reach out to them afterwards. That also helps participants, because sometimes when you're a participant and you go on a study tour and you come back, you might get asked by your manager to present on what you learned about. Well, if you've got a 30-page summary document in front of you, it's easier to give that presentation or to circulate that presentation in lieu of a formal presentation. So just because you don't go on it doesn't mean you don't benefit.
And maybe I'll go for a minute. I heard recently that you actually do like one-on-one like mentorship and coaching and training sessions. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I have recently started one-on-one coaching. It's virtual. The idea is maybe you're a nonprofit that does not have the resources to hire a full-time researcher or full-time director of research. Maybe you even have limited funds in terms of outsourcing for research projects, but you want some research done. Maybe you have some policy questions, because I wear two hats. I do research, but I also do policy analysis. So not everyone does both. With coaching, you arrange to speak with me virtually. We'll talk for about an hour a month, and you can ask me anything you want. It can be particularly good for someone who's new to the sector. So imagine someone's from a related sector. They're new to the homelessness or non-market housing sector, and they hear loads of acronyms and terms. And maybe they don't want to stand up in a meeting and say, hey, I don't know what any of these expressions mean. I don't know what any of these acronyms mean, because they don't want to maybe show that kind of vulnerability in a public space or semi-public setting. With coaching, it's a safe space where we talk for an hour, you ask me questions, and then anything I can't answer, I offer to go off and research for you and put a briefing note together, which would be far cheaper than commissioning a full report. Maybe you've also got questions like, hey, my organization's been asked to sign on to this campaign, but I'm not so sure. What do you think of it? Hey, I've got this idea for a new program. What do you think of it? What's your first thought? Can you go off and look into this for me a little bit? So you might want feedback on a document, something. So it's like you have access to me without having to hire me full time, and it's informal. You don't necessarily have to, go out and fundraise for a research report. It's just a relatively, I would say, not very laborious, not a very strong ongoing commitment. It's pretty light in terms of the hours and cost.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you can be like a cheat sheet mentor for people in the housing and homelessness space, which is super helpful because, like you said, there is sometimes transitions and leadership and everything that require kind of catching up on where the sector is, or being able to like pull out of operations to focus on those strategic elements of like what's happening across the sector. So maybe if you would just I know you highlighted your website of where to get your reading material. Is that where people would also reach out for coaching and mentoring and training?
Absolutely. If you go to nickfalvo.ca, you'll see my website with a lot of tabs on the front. You'll see one for coaching, which explains how it works. You'll see one with blogs. You'll see one with my free open access textbook. You'll notice that I'm quite passionate about making information available free to people. Everything I write, I try to put up there as long as the client's okay with it. Anything I write, I summarize in a top 10 blog post that's short enough that you can read on your phone while you're having your breakfast cereal in the morning. I try to make things accessible and free as much as possible, and you'll see a lot of free resources at that website, nickfalvo.ca. And don't be a stranger. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nick. Anything else you want to share before we wrap up?
Keep up the great work, Emmy. It's an amazing podcast you've got. I love listening to it.
Well, thank you for contributing. You certainly are a leader in the space, a very, thoughtful, lots of information there. So to our listeners too, don't hesitate to rely on Nick as a resource for your work. Sometimes, the emergency or the direness of the situation can cause us to be very entrenched. So I do see this as a helpful resource. So thank you, Nick, for sharing today. Awesome. Well, this episode featured Nick Falvo, a leading Canadian researcher on homelessness and housing policy. His work continues to shape how organizations, governments, and practitioners understand emerging trends and develop more effective responses to homelessness. Through his research, training, and international study tours, Nick brings practical insights and global perspective to one of Canada's most pressing challenges. Thank you for listening to On the Way Home, a podcast brought to you by Blue Door. Stay tuned for more conversations driving change in housing and homelessness.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.